On this Remembrance Day, crowds return in the nation's capital to reflect and pay their respects.
We're just so fortunate and blessed to be here.
The gratitude, the grief, and what delayed the ceremony. Europe's stranded migrants, the escalating crisis, and the new threat from the president of Belarus. The murder trial gripping America as the judge lashes out.
Come on!
Plus, an Indigenous veteran's service and sacrifice.
He returned a decorated military hero.
He served with distinction, so why was he denied the recognition he deserved?
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Across this country, Canadians remember the courage, service and sacrifice of the men and women who lost their lives while serving in the military. Remembrance Day ceremonies usually take place with military precision, but in Ottawa today at the National War Memorial, a security issue disrupted things. The Prime Minister and his wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, arrived about 15 minutes late. The other dignitaries, including the Silver Cross Mother and the Governor General, were also delayed. That meant the 2 minutes of silence, always observed at exactly 11 a.m., was delayed too. The RCMP later said a suspicious package was spotted in the vicinity of the ceremony. They say as a precaution, it was investigated and the dignitaries were held back until the package was cleared. There was another ceremony in Ottawa today too, one that gets less attention. It's held at the National Aboriginal Veterans Monument. Michael Couteur begins our coverage tonight.
The somber notes of the last post, an enduring ritual of remembrance. The pandemic paused large events last year, but fewer restrictions now meant more people could gather at the National War Memorial. Barb Sutherland has waited 7 years to make the 12-hour drive to Ottawa for this moment and this feeling.
How so very fortunate I am to be standing here, while so many others weren't able to, and gave us this freedom that we have today.
A lesson not lost on 9-year-old Dimitri Lauren, who was here with his mother.
To remember the people that died in the war.
That same sentiment is felt by a group of Indigenous veterans who every year, hours before the national ceremony, hold their own solemn reflection at a monument dedicated to Aboriginal veterans.
Where we were equals on the battlefield, and today we will again stand shoulder to shoulder with our comrades in arms.
A few know about the event and only a few dozen attend. Tim Lone is here every year. He served in the military for a decade and worked on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Understanding our heroes that went off also included Indigenous peoples and died, and to unpack that history is part of reconciliation.
For Olone, the fact that this small ceremony is getting more attention is a big step. On this day, the veterans who made it home think of those who did not.
I feel for the families of veterans who served, particularly those who didn't come back.
Representing those families was this year's Silver Cross Mother, José Simard, whose daughter Corporal Karine Blais died in Afghanistan in 2009. That pain and sense of loss shouldered by one mother, but shared by a nation each year on this day. Michael Couture, Global News, Ottawa.
Our Ottawa Bureau Chief Mercedes Stephenson was at the ceremony this morning as well. She joins me now. Mercedes, today is about remembering, but we can't ignore the fact the military has had a difficult year. The crisis in leadership over misconduct allegations, the fact that Taliban is now back in charge in Afghanistan. What have you been hearing from veterans today?
Well, Donna, I spent this afternoon talking to veterans and messaging with them on things like Instagram and Twitter, and it is an incredibly difficult year for a lot of our men and women who served in uniform. In fact, a number who I talked to, some of whom survived serious IED blasts in Afghanistan, say that they just didn't feel up to coming out. They felt deeply disappointed. They feel disappointed by the leadership in the Canadian Forces in some cases when it comes to the sexual misconduct scandal. In other cases, or compounding, it's the withdrawal from Afghanistan. These are people who suffered through the internal dust that you and I both experienced, Donna, the explosions, the wail of the bagpipes on the tarmac there as Canadians who fell were taken home. And they really are questioning what it was all for at this point and having a very difficult time. So certainly this is a really challenging Remembrance Day for a lot of veterans who are feeling like what they served for has all come into question.
And it's important to note, Mercedes, that even though we're not involved in a war right now, there are thousands of Canadians in uniform serving in the forces.
There are, and our thoughts go out to all of those who are deployed. They are on Navy deployments around the world. They are in Iraq. They are in Latvia. They are in Jamaica. They are all over, and we don't hear about them that often, but that doesn't make their sacrifice any less. They are far from home today, and certainly our hearts go out to them and our thanks for their service as they continue to serve amid what experts say are increasing threats to Canadian national security.
All right, Mercedes Stephenson at the National War Memorial in Ottawa, thanks. There were Remembrance Day ceremonies all across Canada today. In Halifax, home to one of the largest Canadian Forces bases, hundreds gathered at the Grand Parade to honor the fallen. In Edmonton, local legions held scaled-back ceremonies this year after larger events were cancelled because of the pandemic. And in Vancouver, despite the public being encouraged to watch virtually, people did join veterans and dignitaries at Victory Square. Ceremonies were also held around the world today. This is London, where the Duchess of Cornwall led Armistice Day commemorations at Westminster Abbey's Field of Remembrance. Queen Elizabeth did not attend, but Buckingham Palace says she will take part in Remembrance Day services at the Cenotaph in London on Sunday. The 95-year-old monarch has been under doctor's orders to rest. And in Paris, French President Emmanuel Macron was joined by U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris for the traditional Armistice Day ceremony at the Arc de Triomphe. On the border of Poland and Belarus, this was not a day to remember. Thousands of migrants are stuck at the border in freezing temperatures with no shelter. Neighboring countries are now warning the crisis could escalate into a military conflict. And Belarus issued a new threat today. Its president claims he'll shut off a pipeline supplying Russian gas to Europe if any new sanctions are imposed on his country. Crystal Goomansingh reports.
The crisis is worsening along the border between Belarus and Poland. Food, blankets, and other life-saving items are being handed out, but support for the migrants stranded in the freezing cold is limited. Polish officials won't let in the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent.
We are completely unable to reach all those people with critical assistance.
Thousands from war-torn and economically challenged countries made their way to Belarus after being told they could cross into Europe. Yusuf Anahala made it into Poland but thought he'd die along the way, freezing, hungry, and struggling with injuries after allegedly being assaulted by a Belarusian soldier.
He kicked me in the face with his foot, so I passed off about a couple minutes. Broke my nose and broke a bone in here, and my eyes are swollen like that.
The European Union accuses Belarus of luring migrants towards the border. They believe it's retaliation for sanctions imposed on Belarus for human rights abuses. Belarus's president, Alexander Lukashenko, denies the allegations. On Thursday, he raised the stakes, threatening to shut off natural gas supplies to Europe. We are heating Europe, and they are still threatening us, he said. 2 Russian gas lines to Europe pass through Belarus. Europe has been struggling with gas supply issues and skyrocketing costs since January, but the bloc says it will not be intimidated. More sanctions are now being considered, while the countries bordering Belarus warn of the growing risk of a military clash. Crystal Goomansingh, Global News, London.
In Glasgow, negotiating teams are still trying to agree on targets and rules on how to cut carbon emissions at the UN Climate Summit. The president of the summit is calling on delegates from almost 200 countries to step up their efforts to reach a deal.
We are not there yet on the most critical issues. there is still a lot more work to be done. And COP26 is scheduled to close at the end of tomorrow. So time is running out.
Alex Sharma says the latest drafts show significant progress, but more effort is needed on several key issues, including climate finance. And protesters in Scotland are sounding the alarm. Activists set up an air raid siren, calling on world leaders to do more. It's one of the many demonstrations held during the two-week COP26 summit. The former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission will facilitate talks about compensation aimed at reaching a settlement with the federal government about Indigenous child welfare. Murray Sinclair spent 6 years documenting the legacy of residential schools in Canada. He's a former senator as well and was also Manitoba's first Indigenous judge. The federal government has appealed a court ruling upholding an order for it to pay $40,000 to Indigenous children who were unnecessarily taken into the child welfare system. The goal of the talks with Sinclair is to reach an out-of-court settlement expected to be worth billions by the end of this year. Accused killer Kyle Rittenhouse is grilled in court. Coming up, why the murder trial is dividing Americans. In a courtroom in Kenosha, Wisconsin, a remarkable criminal trial is unfolding involving 18-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse. He's on trial for shooting 3 men during street protests against racial injustice. Rittenhouse claims he was defending himself that night. The prosecution contends he was an armed vigilante looking for infamy. And as Jackson Prosco reports, his murder trial is another sign of how divided America has become.
On the stand, Kyle Rittenhouse sobbed uncontrollably when asked about the night he shot 3 men, killing 2 of them.
That's right, run.
Rittenhouse insisted he acted in self-defense, arguing the men attacked and chased him during protests in the summer of 2020.
I used deadly force.
That you knew was going to kill?
I didn't know if it was going to kill them, but I used deadly force to stop the threat that was attacking me.
The trial centers around Rittenhouse's intent that August night. Prosecutors argue the 17-year-old acted as a vigilante, showing up armed to protests over the police shooting of Jacob Blake. The defense portrayed Rittenhouse as a scared kid who came under assault by a mob.
You never said a word to him other than approach him with your gun out from 3 feet away, right?
Yes.
The case has become a lightning rod in the culture wars. Rittenhouse has emerged as a hero to many on the right. His $2 million bail was paid through donations.
Don't get brazen with me.
Judge Bruce Schrader has also emerged as a controversial figure, ruling those killed or injured could not be referred to as victims. The judge repeatedly scolded prosecutors, accusing them of improperly trying to introduce prohibited testimony.
When the judge says, I'm excluding this, you just to take it upon yourself to put it in because you think that you've found a way around it? Come on.
That prompted the defense to request a mistrial with prejudice. The judge reserved his decision. Instead, the case will soon be in the hands of a jury who will have to weigh which version of events they believe. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
South Africa's last apartheid president has died of cancer. F.W. de Klerk was 85 years old. De Klerk oversaw the end of the country's white minority rule, a system of legalized racism. In 1990, he ordered the release of Nelson Mandela from prison after 27 years, and he became a key figure in the transition to democracy. De Klerk and Mandela went on to share a Nobel Peace Prize. De Klerk was a controversial figure during a time of brutal racial discrimination in South Africa. And in a pre-recorded video message released after his death, de Klerk apologized for the pain and indignity of apartheid. And Lee Maracle, an award-winning Indigenous author, poet, and teacher, has died. Maracle received worldwide attention for her lifelong advocacy for Indigenous equality in Canada. She mentored up-and-coming Indigenous writers, won several literary awards, and was named to the Order of Canada in 2018. Maracle, a member of the Stolo Nation, recently returned to BC, where she grew up. Her son says she was a fierce-hearted woman. She was 71 years old. Sniper and Savior ahead, the story of one of Canada's most decorated Indigenous soldiers. This is the Peace Tower on Parliament Hill tonight, a virtual cascade of thousands of poppies. 100 years after the poppy became a symbol of remembrance, each one represents one of Canada's fallen soldiers. There are many stories of bravery and sacrifice by Indigenous veterans, but for years they've been overlooked, not given the respect and recognition they deserve. Francis Pegamagabo's story is extraordinary. An Ojibwe man, he was a sniper during the First World War, and though he proved himself an equal on the battlefield, he wasn't treated equally when he got home. Mike Drolet has his story.
It's not easy to find the final resting spot of one of the most decorated Indigenous soldiers in Canadian history. Francis Pegamagabo the sniper would have likely wanted it that way. Where there is no doubt is that he would have found this quiet corner of the Wasauksing First Nation near Parry Sound peaceful, free from the horrors of war and politics of a country that all but forgot what he did.
I would say his story may have been sleeping. It was a story that was, told in quiet settings within his family or from amongst community members.
He was known as Peggy to his fellow soldiers and a terror to the enemy. During some of the most horrific battles of the First World War, Somme, Ypres, Passchendaele, he would sneak into no man's land and wait. His patience led him to being credited with 378 kills and over 300 enemy captured. And after 4 years on the front lines, he was discharged with $898.68 in pay. He was happy to return to the shores of Georgian Bay, but like most Indigenous veterans, he had hoped for a newfound respect. Instead, it was more of the same, poverty and persecution. And the country he fought and bled for still wouldn't grant him citizenship.
They were trying to prove themselves as equals, not to assimilate, but to prove themselves as equals, as Indigenous men, as Indigenous Canadians.
Pegamagabo never did stop fighting, working tirelessly to get more autonomy for band councils. Until he died in 1952, he dedicated his life fighting for Indigenous rights.
Of course, he returned a decorated military hero, but it was that work he did at community levels, at organizational levels, at being a warrior for the rights, for the language, for the culture of his people. Those are the active contributions that I think we most know him for.
In Wasauksing today, the name Francis Pegamagabo is revered in both Ojibwe and English.
He was one of 39 Canadian soldiers awarded the military medal and 2 bars for bravery.
But it took until 2016 before he was immortalized in bronze, strong and defiant, on the shores of Georgian Bay. A hero given his due. Mike Drolet, Global News, Parry Sound, Ontario.
No stone left alone. Next, how younger Canadians connect with the stories of fallen soldiers. There are many ways Canadians can reflect on those who served and sacrificed for our country. The No Stone Left Alone initiative is one of them. Students place poppies on the headstones of veterans, connecting them to the stories of the fallen. It's a simple gesture, but an important and meaningful one. Ross Lord visited one special event in the small town of Middleton, Nova Scotia.
Their faces are covered, but their hearts are open. Students from Nova Scotia's Middleton Regional High School paying tribute to airmen who died during training missions in the Second World War at nearby CFB Greenwood.
Greenwood had 56 crashes, but 65 men, Commonwealth men, were killed. And of those men, 24 are buried here.
For many of these students, like Air Cadet Connor Aubuchon, laying poppies at headstones comes naturally.
Albert J. Botcher, Royal Air Force. My family has been primarily infantry.
Henley Maurice Albert William, pilot officer, navigator, Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve.
I was just kind of thinking about the people that are under the earth and how they were so determined to just protect our country to the point where it cost them their life.
These tributes are coordinated by the No Stone Left Alone Memorial Foundation, started by this Edmonton family. They lay poppies every year to honor family members who served in the military.
Looking out at these vast amount of headstones, I wondered, why is it only our grandparents? Like, why do we stop here and we place it only on them?
10 years later, No Stone Left Alone has grown into a national symbol of gratitude.
Pretty soon, word got out, and it continued to grow from there. And so this year, it warms my heart. We have 100 communities, even during this COVID.
Half the people these days don't even think about Remembrance Day anymore. They just think it's something that they have to sit through an hour long and just, they don't get to go on their phones. But I think it's nice to respect and honor all the people who have sacrificed their lives, because we wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for them.
Even a small gesture can have big meaning. Just ask relatives of pilot officer Trevor Pittock. He was training to be a navigator when his plane flew into a fog-shrouded hill in 1943.
It's sort of connects me in a funny way. I mean, I don't know the students, I don't know who's doing it, but it is comforting to know that somebody is, he's being remembered and somebody is making that connection.
The venerable poppy in capable new hands. Ross Lord, Global News, Middleton, Nova Scotia.
And that is Global National for this Thursday, Remembrance Day. I'm Donna Friesen. We leave you with images from the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Ottawa, where it's become a tradition for people to come and lay their poppies after the national ceremony. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.